Byung-Chul Han is a South Korean cultural commentator, a long-time resident of Germany, and the author of several short works on aesthetic and social theory. In 2024, The New Yorker ran an article headlined "The Internet's New Favorite Philosopher," claiming that Han diagnosed the frenetic aimlessness of the digital age. He was born in 1959, he studied philosophy at Freiburg and Munich, and gained a doctorate in 1994 with a dissertation on Martin Heidegger. Afterwards, he became a full-time academic. What is Power is one of his many short texts and was first published in 2005. In his preface, he claims that when it comes to power, theoretical chaos still reigns. The concept remains altogether ambiguous. His aim, he says, is to formulate a basic form of power from which we can, by modifying its inner structural elements, derive the basic forms in which power may appear. He thinks that all forms of power presuppose the existence of a self, albeit power manifests itself on a continuum. Every power space is a continuum of a self, he says, that maintains itself against another. Continuity and subjectivity are structural elements that are common to all manifestations of power. Power involves an ego against an alter or other. Self seeks to realize itself in the other, then revitalize itself by means of this realization. Power is the capacity to be with oneself in the other, he says. For Han, power does not necessarily consist in coercion. The model of coercion does not do justice to the complexity of power, he says. Power as coercion consists in enforcing one's own decisions against the will of the other. It therefore displays only a very low degree of mediation between ego and alter. Nor is Han keen on the reduction of power to violence. In contrast to naked violence, power can be associated with sense, he writes in chapter 2. Then shortly afterwards, sense is power. Only power lets things participate in sense. In this respect, too, power is anything but mute, senseless coercion. It is eloquent. In fact, sense seems to be key to understanding the effective deployment of power, but it also requires habitus, defined as the totality of a social group's habits or dispositions. It comes about through the internalization of values and perceptions that are formed with regard to a particular order of rule. Power, he goes on, which establishes itself or stabilizes itself through habitus, works at the symbolic level. Its effectiveness is achieved, in the words of Pierre Bourdieu, not at the level of physical strength, but at that of sense and knowledge. Han is, of course, keen to distinguish his theory of power from two recent forebears in the field, Michel Foucault on the one hand and Friedrich Nietzsche on the other. He thinks Foucault's monism of power limits the dimensions of the social, whereas Nietzsche's monism of power interprets all processes involving sense as also processes of power. For Han, not all power involves sense. Power may be irrational. What is Power consists of 5 short chapters, the last of which is called The Ethics of Power. The author makes no attempt to sum up his position at the end, so I'll stop there. There's hardly anything else to add, and I don't think Han is convincing. Arguably, a much better way of answering the question, what is power, would be to look at the way in which the word functions across cultures. German, from which perspective Han is writing, distinguishes Macht, human or institutional power, from Kraft, the power exerted by natural forces like wind and rain. French makes a parallel but not congruent distinction between pouvoir, something like capacity, and puissance, which is more concrete. The English term power conflates Macht and Kraft, and probably the two French terms, so it's worth asking how far each different language possesses a term or terms suitable for the first steps in a philosophical investigation. The argument for the English would be that it might seem to represent an older conception. In the Bible, for example, invading armies, which would be Macht, are often described in terms taken from the natural world, which would be Kraft. In fact, all too often, natural forces are how ancient deities manifest themselves. Of course, even in German, Macht and Kraft aren't entirely mutually exclusive. In any language with similarly dual terms, there's probably an overlap. Once we accept that, power is fairly easy to define. It's the capacity of something, it could be a person, an institution, or an object, to control events in order to either A, reach its goal, or B, frustrate the goals of others. It could be a rocket to achieve escape velocity, or a criminal to evade arrest, or an emperor to enact a new policy, or a computer to process data. The other problem with Han's analysis is that it strongly resembles Hegel's master and slave dialectic in his 1807 treatise, The Phenomenology of Mind. Master and slave become ego and alter, and ultimately they can't do without each other. So there's your continuum, which might not matter if Hahn addressed the resemblance. Curiously, however, although Hegel's extensively discussed in Chapter 3, The Metaphysics of Power, there's no explicit reference to the master and slave dialectic anywhere in What is Power, and only one reference to the phenomenology. Generally speaking, I'm unconvinced by Hahn. I think his books are full of dogmatic overgeneralizations, and while they name-check a lot of important philosophers and say some interesting things about the contemporary world, I think they're unnecessarily prolix. Mostly they're far too short to do justice to their topics, with the result that for all their wearing of their philosophical credentials on their sleeve, they're shallow. And given all that, they're also horrendously overpriced. At this point in the 21st century, we need philosophers who can write clearly and argue effectively, and whose books are within the ordinary person's budget. Sorry to be a grouch. The end.